Hello, and welcome to our latest Nesta Talks To, our conversational event series for today's most exciting thinkers on the big topics related to our missions and innovation methods. My name's Laurie Smith, and I lead much of the research in the Discovery Hub at Nesta, the UK's innovation agency for social good. We design, test, and scale solutions to society's biggest problems. Our three missions are to help people live healthy lives, create a sustainable future where the economy works for both people and the planet, and give every child a fairer start. The Discovery Hub is responsible for helping bring the outside into the organisation by considering the consequences of external trends for Nesta's work, which provides the link to the subjects of today's discussion: emerging technologies, democracy, truth, and the future. And here to talk to us about this topic is Jason Matheny.
Hey,
Welcome,
Laurie.
Jason. Hello.
Good to see you.
Jason is President and Chief Executive Officer of the RAND Corporation, a non-profit, non-partisan research organisation that helps improve policy and decision-making through research and analysis. Prior to becoming RAND's President and CEO in July 2022, he led White House policy on technology and national security, the National Security Council, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Jason has served on many non-partisan boards and committees, including the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, to which he was appointed by Congress in 2018. Welcome, Jason. So, before I started, I want to invite our audience to join the conversation in the comments box on the right-hand side of your screen and ask any questions throughout the event. Closed captions can be accessed via the LinkedIn live stream. So, let's start with existential risk and emerging technologies, which have received considerable attention of late following advances in AI and the pandemic, and I think have been a theme of your career, Jason. What got you involved in these topics?
Yeah. First, thanks, Laurie. It's great to talk. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. I think what got me started in existential risk was in 2002. I was working in India on traditional infectious disease control, malaria, HIV, tuberculosis. My background was in epidemiology, and I had expected to work in international health, for the rest of my career. But in 2002, the first virus was synthesized from scratch, and it was sort of an oh crap moment for the public health community, because we realized at that point we didn't just have to deal with natural infectious diseases. We might also have to deal with artificial infectious diseases, either by accident or by some intentional outbreak. And I then moved from working on traditional infectious diseases to working in national security, biosecurity. And I think over the next few years, really became increasingly concerned about the trajectory of emerging technologies and the risks that they might pose. Enormous upside potential, of course, from technologies like synthetic biology and AI, but also with a need to prevent and mitigate risks that were going to come alongside those benefits.
And you mentioned sort of synthetic as the sort of first synthetic virus and synthetic biology. What's your take on where we are with that now? That was sort of some years ago. What's the sort of where do you think we are with that issue?
I think we're in a pretty risky period right now. There's actually very little governance of synthetic biology. If you want to synthesize the smallpox virus, there's very little to stop you. You can buy a DNA synthesizer. The information that's needed, the blueprint for the virus is available online. The recipe for how you synthesize viruses is also available. You do need technical training, but it's technical training that is, provided in universities. And in some parts of the world, you could probably even find a DNA synthesis provider to do much of the work for you. In fact, all compliance with synthesis screening right now is voluntary, and it's frequently incomplete. So I think we're in a risky window right now.
And do you think things have improved at all since the pandemic, given there are some sort of concern that it might have come from a lab, or even if it didn't, there's still that sort of risk? Has anything changed? I know there was Toby Ord, who's another sort of existential risk expert, was saying that the sort of Biological Weapons Convention Secretariat has an annual budget similar to the average McDonald's restaurant, which seems somewhat worrying given the scale of the challenge.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think things have improved. The policy community, I think, has felt pandemic fatigue from budgets focused on addressing COVID, and that made it actually harder to get policymaker attention on preventing future biological events, whether natural, accidental, or intentional. I think Toby is still accurate on that point about the tiny budget for the Biological Weapons Convention. I think it's one of the more striking statistics in his excellent book, The Precipice.
And you sort of mentioned how easy it is to sort of get the necessary sort of tools to do the synthetic biology. And this raises the sort of idea, which I'm sure you've heard of, sort of garage biology, which is a little bit like the sort of growth of computing, in the early 80s and sort of late 1970s. And do you see things perhaps going that direction at all?
Yeah, it's hard to tell what it'll look like, 10 years from now, where it might be less of a hobbyist discipline and more, more consolidation in DNA synthesis activity. That would have upsides and downsides. There's a lot of innovation that's sort of happening at the individual lab level or the hobbyist level. At the same time, that means that there's a lot of things that could go wrong, either accidentally or intentionally. I do think it's really important for there to be some form of DNA synthesis screening and some level of governance of where DNA synthesis machines are going. Sometimes I think about the comparison between biology or biological weapons and nuclear weapons. One way in which biological weapons are a lot more dangerous than nuclear weapons is that they self-replicate. So if you have a relatively small arsenal of biological weapons, it's pretty trivial to scale it up, to make it much larger. Effectively, because of the self-replication of biological weapons, the world becomes the weapon. The number of people who end up serving as hosts of the weapon itself and then vectors for that weapon ends up being the reason that these weapons are so dangerous. And we don't have right now especially effective defenses that scale as well as the weapons themselves. So I think we're quite vulnerable.
Really interesting. And so moving on to a sort of risk others have been talking about, I'm sure you're sort of aware of the sort of ChatGPT and generative AI models. What do you think are, if any, are the existential risks that might be posed by those tools?
I doubt that current generative AI tools, like ChatGPT or Claude or others that are available today pose an existential risk. I do think some of those tools could make it easier to build cyber weapons, possibly easier to build bioweapons. But I think most of the risk is in the future. That if we just think about the overall trajectory of these systems, it's likely that they'll increase in capability. That means that the benefits from these tools could substantially increase. It also means that the risks from those tools could substantially increase. So again, I think this is an area we'll need good governance. And it's hard often for policy to keep up with technological change. Technological change tends to happen much faster than policy change. So I think this is an area where we'll just need to be especially thoughtful about how to future-proof certain kinds of policies to make sure that they can adapt as the technologies change.
I suppose that leads to the idea of, you sort of talk about the need of policy to keep up with technology, and technology is often moving faster. There's sort of an idea around sort of anticipatory regulation or anticipatory governance. Do you see that as a way of managing that sort of problem, or do you think we'd have to go down a different sort of route?
Yeah, I think with there's the line attributed to like multiple authors that prediction is hard, especially about the future. But I think it's it is true that like making technology forecasts is especially difficult, and there's been empirical work by the Tory group and others looking at the history of technology forecasting. We tend not to be very accurate after more than like a 5-year time horizon. So what you, I think, want in cases like this, like in the case of AI or synthetic biology, you want to sort of create a platform for policy that can adapt as the technology itself evolves. So one, for example, is building up institutional capacity within government for people who understand the technology. In the U.S. government, this has been a challenge. Most of our policy experts have tended to come from a legal background. Very smart, very thoughtful, but often don't have a strong grounding in the technologies. Our technologists in the U.S. very frequently don't want to work on policy. So I think one robustly good thing that can be sort of future-proof is build in institutional capacity of people who work at the intersection of technology and policy, create a sort of career track for people who want to pursue that. The second is ensuring that our policy schools are doing more to generate that pipeline and support it. Third is figuring out mechanisms that we can bring in talent from technology into policy roles. We have something in the US called the Intergovernmental Personnel Act, which allows a sort of freer exchange of talent across the private sector and public sector. I think that's really important. And then have a larger pool of advisors and experts who can consult with appropriate guardrails against conflicts of interest. I think ultimately, good governance comes down to having really thoughtful people who are thinking about these hard policy problems. So personnel is the thing that I would prioritize.
Really helpful. And we sort of touched on synthetic biology, and we touched on sort of risks from AI. But what's the sort of existential or at least significant risk that we should be talking about, but we're not? I suppose in the same way that there was sort of with a sort of pandemic, people are aware of that for some time, but it wasn't in the sort of national consciousness. But is there something we should be thinking about now that no one's chatting about?
Yeah, it's a great question. To think of another historical example, I think, nobody was thinking about nuclear weapons as an existential threat until the 1930s. Maybe with the exception of H.G. Wells. And from the mid part of the 1930s in a very private way until the middle of the 1940s, there were a small number of people who sort of thought okay, this actually could be an existential threat. And then it became a sort of more public recognition of that as an existential threat. So it is likely that there are either future technologies that are not yet visible to us that could pose existential threats, or other categories of risk, possibly non-technological. For one example, I do think that there's kinds of risks to democratic governance that at least could pose existential threats to the way that democracies function. We're seeing increased, political polarization in the U.S. and in the U.K. and several other democratic states. Increased, sort of political paralysis, cultural polarization, and I think some of the drivers of that are technological things like certain kinds of social media platforms and information bubbles, personalized search. But part of it also is just a lack of sort of shared feeling that we're in this together. And those kinds of cultural trends that lead to existential threats to governance, I don't know enough about what drives that and ultimately how to mitigate it. But it's something I think poses a real risk to shared governance.
And how would you get? You've obviously worked with lots of very sort of senior decision makers, and obviously a senior decision maker yourself. But given with those risks that aren't necessarily yet on people's radar, but are important. How do you get people to listen? Or how do you, are there sort of systems or structures or methods people can use to get more attention on those sort of issues, particularly when politicians are sort of battered with the day-to-day of, what's happening in the news right at the moment?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, one of my colleagues at Rand, Andy Hohen, just wrote a book called The Age of Danger, but part of which discusses this general problem of how do you get policymakers to pay attention to something that might be just over the horizon, as opposed to the tyranny of the immediate, the things that are completely dominating policymakers' attention today. It's quite difficult, because there are things that are urgent today that are incredibly important. There are things that might be even more important that are years hence or even decades hence that we need to start preparing for. But freeing up the sort of political attention span for those kinds of risks is deeply challenging. I think that it does make sense to have certain parts of the policy community, though, whose full-time job is to think about those things. In the United States, we have, as part of the intelligence community, the National Intelligence Council, within which there's this strategic futures group that thinks about longer-term risks. Within the Defense Department, we have something called the Office of Net Assessment, which is sort of a think tank within our Pentagon that thinks about longer-term risks. I think these are very small functions, a handful of people. I think we need more people who think about those things, because often the work that we need to do to prevent or mitigate a risk that might be coming 10 years from now is something we actually need to start on today. There's a lot that we could have done to reduce the risk from synthetic biology years ago, when we could sort of see what was going to be coming. We could have baked in security and safety. We could have brought in much more expertise, for example, from the biotechnology community. Same right now for AI. I think we can see in general where this technology might be headed. We can see that it'll be profoundly important to the future, and we need to start planning for that. But there's very few parts of government that right now have the capacity to do that sort of planning.
And pivoting from sort of emerging technologies, which you might come back to with the questions from the audience, another interest, you sort of meant interests of democracy and truth. So getting into the specifics a bit, what impacts do you think, say, generative AI is going to have on democracy and truth, if any?
Yeah, I think so. First, there will be some positive effects. When I use some of the large language models today, I use it to tutor myself about something that I'm stupid about. I just want to get smarter on topic X. I'll generate a prompt for one of the models to explain something to me. And it doesn't always get it perfectly right. I mean, there's still these hallucination problems and other errors, but it's a lot better than what I could have done myself, either by trying to synthesize a bunch of text or by even doing some real digging on Wikipedia or others. I find it's just a really good way of synthesizing content. I can say, summarize deterrence theory in 10 paragraphs, and it does a pretty good job of that. So I think we have, in the near term, digital tutors that will be accessible to us that can lead to an even better informed citizenry. And I think that's so fundamental to democratic function. But we also have, with these tools, the potential to produce disinformation at scale. So fake text, fake photos, fake audio, fake video. I think that will be a challenge. I don't think that this will be a fatal challenge to democracy. I think that with a few high-profile instances of disinformation, of it being really disruptive, I think it is likely to lead to either regulations or other policy levers that require things like watermarking in synthetic media for assessing provenance. As an analogy, I mean, we still deal with the problem of counterfeit money. And it's a problem, it's a nuisance, but it's not existential. I mean, actually, except for North Korea. Like, it's existential for North Korea because North Korea's economy actually depends on counterfeit currencies. But for the rest of the world, it's a nuisance because we have relatively good mechanisms for spotting counterfeits, and those mechanisms were sort of built into the generation of currency. I think it's likely that we'll have similar mechanisms at some point to assert the authenticity of media. But I think we're going to have some rocky times ahead. I mean, I think in this period where it's unclear how the authenticity of media will be asserted, we're likely to see some high-profile examples of disinformation that's using these generative AI systems.
And sort of panning out from AI specifically to digital technologies in general, they're often sort of blamed as sort of being the cause of sort of the breakdown or starting to break down democracy and truth in countries like the United Kingdom, the United States. To what extent do you think they're the actual cause of the problem, or simply a symptom or accelerant of some other underlying cause? And if there is another underlying cause or causes, what do you think they might be?
Yeah, I do think that social media platforms play a big role in this. Personalized search to the daily me. I mean, it's possible to create these information bubbles for ourselves that are completely insulated from one another. And I'm guilty of this too. I mean, there's a set of news outlets that I follow and a set of blogs that I follow, and I think that the downside of that is that we don't have a shared informational context in which citizens are joined with kind of a common sense of what's happening in the world and common standards for evidence. Rand has for several years had a research program on what we call truth decay, which is a sort of erosion of norms around evidence used in policy debates. And I think one of the causes of truth decay are these information bubbles. But I do think that it's an amplifier for other kinds of division within society. I think part of that is the way in which people identify themselves politically has to do with kind of affiliation with certain kinds of, tribal commitments. Like, well, I'm in tribe X, and tribe X believes such and such, and tribe Y believes something else, and I'm not part of that tribe. And I think that when those identities are formed around things that make compromise very difficult, that's when democracy really gets paralyzed. And I think we've increasingly seen that. So the amplification of these tribal identities that some of these tech platforms have created, I think really does present a challenge to democracy. It's not the only amplifier for this. I mean, I think we've also seen a change in journalistic standards. I think we've seen a decrease in civics education. And I think also geography, plays a role. There's a certain way in which even the physical location of people has reduced the level of contact that people have with folks outside of their tribe. I think all of those are likely to contribute to this phenomenon that we're seeing in several democracies.
And moving on from sort of technologies, but keeping with the sort of topic of democracy, the US is often seen as the home of sort of modern democracy. It now faces sort of growing competition for an increasingly autocratic China. How do you think this is going to play out, and what does this struggle mean for democracy and truth around the world?
Yeah, I think first democracies need to demonstrate that they can deliver for all of their people, not just the wealthiest half or three quarters. When China's diplomats promote China's system of governance in the global south, for example, one of the talking points is, hey, do you really want to be like the Western democracies that have left a large part of their society behind, that have, internal struggles, are now politically polarized? So I think that democracies need to demonstrate that our systems can function for everybody. I do think that democracies are substantially better for the world, for the long-term future. I mean, both because of the freedom and self-determination that they provide to individuals, but also I think democracies just have better error correction systems that can prevent large-scale catastrophes for society. Democracies are imperfect. I mean, we make lots of mistakes. We fumble all the time, but our mistakes tend not to be catastrophic at the level of an entire country, causing tens of millions of deaths. We tend to have avoided things like the Great Leap Forward, where tens of millions of people died in China because of a few autocrats making just terrible decisions, or the Stalinist purges, killing tens of millions of people because of a few autocrats making terrible decisions. So I think the distributed decision making within democracies tends to avoid these extreme catastrophes that we see within autocratic systems. And I think that will be particularly important to have that kind of error correction in an age when we have things like AI and synthetic biology that are capable of existential catastrophes. I also do worry a lot about an autocratic system that uses AI for surveillance and social control, because I think that that allows a totalitarian system to actually be scalable and cost effective in a way that could be permanent. It could cause civilizational lock-in, effectively like a system that is incapable of change or self-correction forever. And I think the prospect of having a civilization that doesn't change, doesn't correct, doesn't make itself better over time is just a tragic waste of human potential.
Moving on to another one of your interests is and also an area where RAND has obviously a long history and reputation about the future and thinking about the future and strategic foresight. What do you think are the most exciting developments in this field at the moment?
One of the things I've worked on for a while is on using crowdsourcing for forecasts. And there's a few parts of crowdsourcing that I really like. First, the fact that it's participatory, that it's inherently democratic, of engaging as many people as possible in thinking about what the future might look like and how we address the governance challenges in the future. And then there's an empirical reason to really like crowdsourcing, which is that it tends to produce more accurate forecasts. So in a job that I had at IARPA, which was a sort of research arm of the intelligence community in the United States, we ran a large forecasting tournament over 4 years, collected millions of forecasts for geopolitical events. Things like, would there be a battle in a particular place? Would there be a foreign election that would go one way versus another? Would there be a weapons test? Economic changes? What would be like inflation rates? All sorts of questions. And I think at the height of this experiment, about 30,000 people participated, some from the government, some people outside of the government, some people who were real professional experts, some people who were hobbyists and just doing this in their free time. And there were a few really interesting findings. One is if you take the unweighted average of hundreds of judgments about a particular question, that's really hard to beat. The unweighted average tends to be a really robust estimate of some event. And the other thing was there are ways of increasing the accuracy even more if you sort of give greater weight to people who've historically been more accurate, or who tend to have a set of approaches to thinking about future events. Like they tend to be ceaselessly self-critical. They tend to update their judgments when presented with new information. They tend not to be like traditional pundits of being like very overconfident. Instead, they tend to be like pretty humble and adjust their judgments when they see reason to. So and the results of some of that work are summarized in a book by Phil Tetlock called Super Forecasting. But there's other descriptions of this. There's some economist articles that talk about this work, and there's an effort in the UK called Cosmic Bazaar based on this research. And I'm overall like very optimistic about the application of doing more crowdsourced forecasting. I think it's one of the things that we should be using much more often. I try to use it for myself personally. Like when I have a major decision to make, I pull, not just my friends, but I also will ask like some of the people who I just think are really thoughtful, whose judgment I'd like. I ask them for like probabilities, will I think this was a good decision 2 years from now? And then I take the average. And I've kept score like over the last 15 years that I've done this. And the unweighted average has been more accurate than either my own judgment or individual judgments.
I like the idea that humility is an important skill in forecasting. Well, now I'll sort of turn things over to the audience. I've got some questions that have come in. One was about there's someone called Thomas Carroll who's joining from the UK NHS, which is our National Health Service, and they're interested in hearing about the impact on health systems and policy. I presume that's probably I think that came early, so it might have been in reference to synthetic biology and artificial intelligence. What are your thoughts about the impact on health of those two technologies?
Great upside potential. I think we're an early expression of the impact of AI on biomedicine would be DeepMind's AlphaFold, which I think is like one of the more stunning breakthroughs in AI application, is solving these kinds of protein folding problems for thousands of proteins, and that has a range of important biomedical applications. We could also see increased application of AI to diagnostics. On synthetic biology, the ability to synthesize organisms that then can produce useful things for us, including medicines, but also other materials, and be able to rapidly design and manufacture new vaccines. So, for example, mRNA vaccines are a great new tool for infectious disease control. On the negative side, AI could be used to design pathogens that are much worse than those found in nature or even in existing biological weapons programs, of which unfortunately there's several that still exist in the world, in countries that do not practice great lab security and don't have really good forms of governance. So I think that's quite worrisome. And I think AI could amplify some of those weapon programs. Synthetic biology, the same. It gives a toolkit for creating viruses and bacteria that are that combine traits that could be quite potent, combine, say, for example, very high transmissibility, high lethality, a longer incubation period that's pre-symptomatic, so that you have biological weapons that could be much more severe than natural pathogens.
And we've got a question here from Alison Driver, who I think you raised your work program on truth decay. So how can we counteract levels of distrust across communities?
Yeah, I wish I knew. I mean, I think we're trying a few things at RAND just to understand what the facts are about communities and distrust within or across communities. Something that we have at RAND called the American Life Panel, which is a panel survey that we use. We're going to start leveraging for this purpose of understanding trust and mistrust. Focus groups. There's a couple of brilliant researchers at RAND who have really been thinking about the experimental or research design that we need in order to get at this problem. But I don't think we have answers yet. I think it's a deeply important question, though. I think a lot of this does come down to trust and mistrust across communities.
And so related to that, it's a question, I'm using Chair's prerogative here, there's a question about this sort of trust. And one of the things that's been leveraged about sort of trust is the sort of stories, say, emerging technologies can generate. So I think Yuval Noah Harari, in a recent talk about AI and the future of humanity, talked about AI's potential ability to create stories that could persuade us of things that aren't necessarily true and can indirectly undermine society. What credence do you give to that sort of concern?
Yeah, there is this. I mean, in the same way that we see that personalized advertising on various web platforms has kind of hitchhiked on errors in human psychology, like that we're susceptible to various kinds of seduction by information. I mean, there are just certain things that we're going to be like easily convinced of, and we're not very skeptical of. And in the same way that advertising exploits some of those, cognitive biases or heuristics, I think increasingly we could see longer narratives that are automatically generated to exploit some of those biases or vulnerabilities. And I think that is a real risk. There's actually, I had a conversation once with some technologists about what they thought might be existential threats that we weren't paying sufficient attention to. And one of them said the lotus eaters, that basically we could, as a society, just sort of feed ourselves with information that made us feel very happy and very satisfied, but wasn't actually leading to any productive advance in society. We could, either put on our VR goggles and just be, roaming around and entertaining ourselves without actually doing anything productive, or do the equivalent of that by absorbing other kinds of media that have been personally created for each of us in ways that kind of like optimize our like euphoria, but don't actually lead to any productive social change and might actually repress effective social change. So this is, I guess, a sort of Aldous Huxley view of what a totalitarian regime could be. It doesn't require necessarily people being put in prisons. It may just be one where the society is effectively comatose because of being fed this steady diet of personalized entertainment.
And so moving a bit, so we've got another question here, moving away from sort of the bigger existential risks to more immediate sort of challenges around, say, generative AI. What do you think, what are your thoughts on the social risks of tools such as ChatGPT and Bard and others? And are there any specific policies you think could mitigate those risks?
Yeah, I mean, some of the societal risks are ones that involve the application of large models to classes of other technologies that can be destructive. So cyber weapons, biological weapons. I think both of those could be more capable and more accessible because of these large AI models. I think it's unlikely that that current large models, like GPT or Claude or a handful of others, would allow a complete amateur to launch a major cyber attack. I think it's probably that a already sophisticated actor could do things at a greater scale or more quickly using some of these tools. But I think it is conceivable that in the next several years, as these tools become even more capable, that will change. That fairly amateur actors could actually be doing things that are fairly sophisticated, and that I think is risky. So I think those are some of the societal risks that I'm most anxious about.
And what's your view? We've got a question here. What's your view on regulating the AI? What should governments or supranational bodies do about it?
I think we do need guardrails, and I've also been impressed by the AI labs themselves saying we think we need guardrails. Like, please, government, give us guardrails, including thinking about the supply chain that ultimately makes these models possible. So everything from the chips that go into the data centers that are used to train the models, the data centers themselves should know your customer screening. Do the cloud providers actually check on who is using their infrastructure to train a large model? Have the models undergone safety testing and red teaming to see ways that they could be misused or ways in which the systems could be misaligned? I was impressed that some of the recent large models had a fair amount of red teaming and safety testing, leveraging work at places like the Alignment Research Center. And then I think we should be having a real debate in policy around open source models. On the one hand, open source software can be a great tool for democratizing tech and for having lots of eyeballs to look at errors and make the tech stronger and more robust. But in other ways, releasing a large language model into the wild without understanding first enough about its safety or security could present enormous risks to society in ways that we might not understand. I mean, we as a society have decided we're not going to open source nuclear weapons or nuclear blueprints. And I think it might be more analogous to that than to say, open sourcing a web browser. So I think we'll just need to be thinking really deeply about what the consequences would be of large open source models.
And what do you think? There was a question which seems to have been gone now, but there was one which I thought was a good one to ask anyway. It was about sort of the risks of sort of mass unemployment from these sorts of technology, and how to sort of handle that with those huge productivity upsides, but also many people may risk losing their jobs and all sorts of social dislocation that can happen as a result.
Yeah, I mean, the world has gone through significant technological change in the past in which we've had time to adapt. So, for example, the introduction of mechanization to agriculture, the introduction of typewriters, of printing presses, of electrification, of industrialization, of computers. I mean, those have been technological changes that led to significant labor change. So folks who had grown up, I think in the United States, about half of the U.S. population in 1900 was employed in agriculture, and now it's around 1% or less. It's not that 49% of the United States is now unemployed. It's just that the daughters and sons of farmers then became something other than a farmer. I think the challenge now is we're seeing such massive technological change happening so quickly that we might not have the ability to adapt on the timescales that are going to be relevant to a family. And it's going to happen not across generations, but within several years of a single generation. So I don't know what the best set of policies will be to provide safety nets for that. Proposals like universal basic income, we need to really think about the economics of that, and how would you employ that? Would it be sort of graduated as the technology continues to displace different categories of labor? I think for a while we'll see the technology is not displacing an entire occupation, but reducing the amount of time that is needed in order to perform a task within that occupation. I think we're already seeing that in applications of AI to things like legal discovery. It hasn't reduced the number of lawyers that are needed, but you need a smaller percentage of a particular lawyer's time needed on a particular kind of task. But I think over time we are going to see categories of labor that shift, and figuring out what will be the appropriate safety net for that is, I think, going to be critical.
And do you think, there's a question here from Antonio Amodio, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. Do you think the state of AI technology is sophisticated enough to sway the upcoming US election? And I suppose there's going to be a UK election in a couple of years as well. Will it sway it in a meaningful way, or could it?
Yeah, possibly. I do worry a lot about this, because I think, I said that I think at some point we're going to figure out a way to deal with disinformation that's AI generated. I think, though, that will take a few years, and I'm worried that we won't have already built in those mechanisms for provenance or watermarking in time for this election. So I think we could see some sophisticated disinformation attacks in the 2024 election in the US. I think that's pretty plausible and worrisome. And unfortunately, the digital forensics that exist right now to really figure out whether something is authentic or not aren't all that reliable, especially with text. So if somebody wants to do spear phishing, or either for cyber attacks or for disinformation, that right now is very hard to detect what's been human generated versus automatically generated. But it's possible that we'll see generated media being used in some significant way to try to sway the election.
But talking of spear phishing, a colleague of mine flagged a paper where someone essentially worked out how to do spear phishing to all of Britain's members of parliament and what tools could be used, which opens up a risk as well, because they're almost telling people how to do that publicly. Moving on to maybe sort of slightly more positive direction, we've got a question here from Millie about how do you stay hopeful in the context of these quite challenging global issues?
Yeah, a friend of mine calls me an apocalyptimist, because I do most of my day job is spent thinking about things that aren't all that pleasant. But I really do think if we can avoid massively fudging things up, the future really could be brilliant. I mean, we've made a lot of progress as a civilization. I mean, it's much better as a human being to be alive today than to be alive a century ago or 1,000 years ago. I mean, we're just so much better off. So many humans are substantially freer, better educated, better fed, better cared for, better loved than we were in years before. And I think things are likely to stay on that track if we just don't completely derail ourselves through one of these existential threats. So that's one thing that makes me hopeful, is just that the long arc of history bends towards justice, but also like bends towards, greater prosperity for most of the planet. The rates of absolute poverty are so much lower today than they were even 50 years ago. It's amazing, the progress. That makes me optimistic. The other thing that makes me optimistic is that I think each generation really does get better, gets more enlightened, gets more thoughtful, more compassionate. I think a lot about our treatment of non-human animals. I think we become more thoughtful about that over time. I think that will also continue to get better. So I really am optimistic as long as we can avoid a handful of these really nasty risks ahead.
And what are you, as sort of CEO of RAND, what are you doing? You mentioned your work on truth decay. What are you doing at RAND that can sort of, I suppose, help realize the opportunities around emerging technologies and strengthen our democracy and think about the future in a better way?
Yeah, so much. RAND it's the world's largest policy research organization. We have 2,000 people from so many different disciplines working on about 1,000 projects at any given time. And I think one of the things that makes me optimistic about the world is that we have organizations like RAND that are really thinking deeply about these policy challenges and how to address them. A lot of RAND's work is descriptive. It's sort of just understanding what is the state of the problem, how do we measure it, can we tell whether we're making progress, and then a lot of it is prescriptive. We think that the best ways of solving this particular policy problem would be A, B, or C, and we'll sort of systematically analyze the options and then figure out their costs and benefits, their advantages and disadvantages. So this analytic approach or evidence-based approach to policy is something that also makes me optimistic, that the fact that there are institutions like RAND and others that try to apply the best in science and research and analysis to the most consequential policy problems. Nesta also gives me a lot of optimism. I've interacted a fair amount with Nesta, over the last several years, and I think that one of the things that makes me optimistic is that you will attract so many smart people who want to make the country and the world better. And this combination of, raw intelligence and incredible levels of compassion and a sort of mission focus, I think that's ultimately what's going to make the world better. It has historically been what made the world better. And anyway, I'm optimistic for reasons like that.
Well, that's exactly the answer I think I wanted and my colleagues wanted to hear. So a final question is, you might be aware Nesta recently published a supplement in partnership with a UK policy magazine, Prospect, where we imagined a fictional minister for the future who'd ask doers and thinkers to propose radical solutions to some of the UK and world's biggest challenges. What would be your proposal to our fictional minister around either, say, emerging technologies or existential risk or democracy or whatever issue you think is important?
Yeah, for radical solutions, there's of course a lot of kind of plainer solutions to our problems, like coming up with good regulatory guardrails around some of these especially risky technologies. But for a radical solution, I do think that some form of significant crowdsourcing effort related to foresight and forecasting that tries to get as many participants across UK society as possible. And it's useful not just for making forecasts that you hope will be accurate, but also forecasts that you just think will be informative. Even if they're inaccurate, you get a sense of how beliefs and attitudes across society related to a particular technology vary. And I think that will be really informative. You get a sense of how much optimism or pessimism there is about the future of AI or biotech. You get a sense of how it varies geographically, how it varies across the political spectrum, across the kind of information that people absorb. And I think it'll give you also then a better sense of, how can we engage more citizens in the kind of governance work that we need to do that's ahead of us.
I think my colleagues in Nesta's a Centre for Collective Intelligence Design, which looks at some super forecasting work, I think inspired by some of the work you're involved in. And I think that would be that they absolutely love that answer. Well, I think we're almost at time. So thank you very much for your sort of really interesting thoughts. I hope it's been useful to the audience. And sort of now we've reached the end of the event, I'd be really grateful if those joining us could perhaps fill in a short survey. The link will be shared in the chat, and it's also available in the event description. As a thank you for filling in the survey, audience members will be entered into a prize draw to win a £50 bookshop.org voucher. And if you haven't already, please sign up to our newsletters where we'll let you know about upcoming events. I think I'm going to be talking to James Bridle about his book Ways of Being sometime next month. So finally, just thank you again very much to Jason. Really, really interesting discussion.
Thanks, Laurie, for the great questions. These are brilliant. And thanks to all the participants for the questions. This was excellent. Really enjoyed it.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye.
Take care.